Episode 2, Values Messaging. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is listening, does it make a sound?
If you believe the Second Amendment deserves a lasting place in American culture, but no one wants to listen to you, do you make a sound?
Our side of the debate tends to focus on being right. It doesn't matter if you're right if nobody wants to listen to you. You're listening to Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we explore ideas and techniques that help you break down partisan barriers, build rapport across the aisle, and make a more persuasive case for the Second Amendment. I'm John Hauptman.
And I'm Sarah Cade. In this episode, we're going to talk about how values messaging can make you more persuasive. John's bad argument of the day is about background checks, and I'll be debuting my segment, Soft Skills. I didn't do a formal segment last time because our Thanksgiving special was kind of already about soft skills, but from here on out, we're going to use our main segment to talk about big ideas, while the other segments are going to focus more on practical techniques, strategies, and specific arguments.
Our goal is to give you some new tools in your toolbox.
John, have you ever tried to change somebody's mind about the Second Amendment using facts and statistics?
Yeah, I have.
How did that go for you?
Well, it's tricky. You feel like you're making a really good case because you've got a whole pile of really good facts on your side, and you've got data from impartial sources, and you've got your personal experience with guns, and you've got all this information and a really strong moral standing on the issue, and it goes nowhere.
Yeah, I've had that same experience, and it's frustrating because, you really feel in your soul that you're right. But one of the things I've learned over time is that proving someone wrong only causes them to stop listening, or worse, to dig in deeper. And so it's really not enough to just be right.
Yeah, the Second Amendment, while it's many things, is not a magic incantation of convincing. Merely uttering it to someone who doesn't feel and believe in it the way we do isn't a abracadabra for convincing them of its value and validity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think you kind of mentioned why right there. If you are a Second Amendment supporter, you probably feel some deep values that underlie your support for the Second Amendment. And you feel that deep in your soul. It's like part of who you are. It's tied to your identity, and it's really important to you. But not everybody shares the same values.
Yeah, you have to appeal to values before you can introduce facts. And you find common ground on values and create the idea that you're working together for the same goal.
Yeah, that's the key. That's the key to building that rapport. And that's what helps open people's minds.
When we say values, what exactly are we talking about?
So we're using values to refer to important and lasting beliefs and ideals about what's good and bad that are shared by a culture. And we're not talking about policies. We're not talking about specific convictions. We're talking about something deeper than that. We're talking about the ideals that underlie all of society. The thing about values is they're not right or wrong. These values are an important part of American culture in general, and a lot of them are things we all share, no matter what party you're in. Where we differ is just on the importance we place on those values.
Yeah, I find that most of the time when I differ with somebody in terms of a significant political opinion, it has to do with the priority with which we rank values, and then the methodology by which we would execute policy. I feel like most of the time we don't have very different goals when talking broadly about issues. Like, nobody wants to see people suffering and starving and going broke and, living a miserable life. But how we can do things to support each other, or how we can create the environment in which people thrive, we differ on how to get from A to B. But the A and the B are roughly fairly similar most of the time.
Yeah, I've had that same experience. I think if you go deep enough and you get general enough, you can find common ground on a lot of these values things. Then you can talk about policy as a team. Yeah,
and when we say that values are neither right or wrong, we're not talking about like a broad nihilistic moral relativism here, where anything goes and a society that thrives on murder and suffering, that's just a matter of opinion. There's a right and a wrong here, for sure.
Right. We're just talking about the underlying currents that are the cause for our beliefs and convictions. In Soft Skills, we'll talk about specific, actionable techniques to help you become a more persuasive communicator.
What would you say you do here? Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people. Can't you understand that? What the hell is wrong with you people?
So right now in American politics, parties are getting more and more polarized. And it's not just parties, it's individuals too. We can't talk to each other, and we desperately need to. The solution is to revive the art and science of civil discourse. Now, it takes two to tango, but if you're really good at it, you can help the other person out. If you're bad at it, you're going to create unnecessary friction.
It's worth considering what kind of energy you bring to the conversation. If you go into it itching for a fight, looking forward to owning someone either in person or online, it might be worth imagining what kind of experience they're going to have with you as the representative of this issue, and whether or not that's going to help us win hearts and minds over any period of time. And obviously, express yourself, be you, but also do that responsibly with the long-term activism in mind.
The most important thing about the soft skills is that they are skills. So wherever you're starting from, you can improve them. We've talked a little bit about appealing to values, but before you can appeal to somebody's values, you have to figure out what they are. So step one in this episode is identifying values. When someone makes a statement you think is wrong, pause, reorient your attitude, and identify their values. Now, the pause part is pretty simple. Just wait. Count to 3 before you react. And during the pause, take a moment to reorient your attitude from negativity to curiosity, especially if the person said something you perceived as an insult. It's not easy. This is probably the hardest thing we're going to work on. One way you can do it is to create your own narrative. For me, I like to imagine myself as a scientist, and my only goal is to just experiment with this conversational technique. You can tell yourself whatever story you want. It's only in your own mind, and it's only to help you accomplish your goal. The key to it, though, is to depersonalize the statement. Because a lot of times these statements, they sound insulting, even if it's not intentional.
Yeah, it's easy to have a strong emotional reaction when someone disagrees with your deeply held values. And in contexts like these, I like to establish a little bit of a mental airlock. And this works when you're having a difficult conversation, or having a business negotiation, or even having a tense moment in a personal relationship. And if you can put a little airlock in your head, that allows you to hear someone's difficult statement and not let it immediately encounter your feelings. You can kind of quarantine it a little bit and dissect it and understand it and hold it at arm's length before you respond to it.
And this works really well, especially if you practice it. If you're like me and you're not a super confrontational person, you might still get that physical reaction when you encounter a statement that goes against your beliefs. But if you take the time to pause, take the time to take a breath, you're not obligated to respond to anything immediately. You can take that time and use it constructively. And in fact, you can even stall for time if you need to. You can take a sip of water, or you can say, "That's really interesting. Let me think about that for a moment." The goal is to prepare yourself for the very difficult emotional work of finding their good intent.
Try to remember how imperfectly you might communicate and how much leeway people need in general to talk through their thoughts and to get to the core of what they mean. A lot of people need to speak out loud in order to get their thoughts in order, or even to find out exactly what they think themselves. So give them the space to do that without shutting them down. Because if you can't let them get through a whole idea, and if they don't have the permission to sort of stumble through it inaccurately before they get to the core of what they mean, you're not going to find out what they actually believe, and frankly, neither will they.
Yeah, that's a great point. And meanwhile, they're thinking the same thing about you, so it kind of goes both ways. And if you can go into this discussion with good intent and do your best to find their good intent and trust them to find your good intent, this conversation is going to be a lot more productive. So once you're in the right frame of mind, you can focus on identifying their values. And to do that, you can scan for keywords. So sometimes the values are contained directly in the statement itself. When they're not, it can be a little tricky, but if you're not sure where to start, look for clues in what qualities they attribute to others and what examples they choose. So, for example, if they say, "Kids are more important than guns," they've just told you directly that family and community are important to them. If they think gun owners are paranoid, they may value stability and order, and they may distrust the unknown. And the unknown in this case is gun culture. In all cases, try to ignore any perceived insult. It's easier said than done, and I know this from experience. Put it in the airlock. We're going to focus on finding what's good and admirable about the people we're talking to. That's the goal. So people can sense genuine good intent, just like they can sense a bad faith argument. To illustrate how this works in practice, we're going to wade into the comments section on my local anti-gun Facebook page. As we read these comments, try to avoid immediately countering what's wrong about them. Instead, pause, reorient your attitude, and let's do this experiment together.
Comment number 1 is, gun violence is a public health crisis.
This one's easy because the value is directly stated. So the value there, if it says public, is community. So it's the idea that we're all in this together, that we all have a stake in this community that we mutually create. The other thing about this one is there's an implied duty of the government to protect public interest. And remember this one, because that'll come in handy for the next episode.
The next comment is guns. That's the most pressing issue for me. There are a lot of other issues, but you can only fix them if you are alive.
The biggest one here is bravery, standing up to the more powerful opponent. And you kind of see this thing a lot, especially on the liberal side of the aisle. There's a little bit of a David versus Goliath. A common theme is standing up for the downtrodden, or standing up for the voiceless. And these are good and admirable things. This comment also implies a desire to make a difference and a desire to have a chance. There's a desire for reform and for progress. And another thing to notice is there's some uncertainty there about how the other team values life. And that's kind of a recurring theme whenever each side talks about life. There's a little bit of doubt and suspicion that the other side doesn't value life in the same way that you do. As we go through these, you'll notice there's a relative ranking of values compared to other values. And there's also a sense of urgency and impending crisis. And that also is common to both sides.
Hearing gun rights protesters talk about training for a violent insurrection makes us even more committed to serious gun reform.
This one shows the importance of group identity and cohesion. There's also a distrust of unearned power. And by that I mean there's an idea on the liberal side of the aisle that guns give you an authority and a power that you haven't earned. You can just go out and buy one. Anyone can have it. It's too easy to get that power and you don't deserve it. You see similar things also from the conservative side of the aisle, but for different issues. So it's kind of something to think about as you're reflecting on these values. Think about your own values and think about similarities you might see between yourself and people on the other side, even if you don't agree on policy.
What is driving paranoia in so many of the men in our culture that they feel like they have to have a gun in order to protect their families?
And this one again shows the distrust of the unfamiliar culture. But the interesting thing there to notice is the word family. So that implies they value the importance of family and community. A lot of times the examples people choose reveal something about them that they don't directly say. And you'll notice this commenter didn't say they need a gun to protect their selfish, horrible lives. They specifically said families. Now we've had some practice identifying values, we'll discuss what to do with that information in the next episode. For now, just focus on finding the good in people.
This week's bad argument of the day is definitely going to bake your noodle a little bit. It's about background checks. Why background checks don't work that great, but not for the reasons that you think. The pro-gun control argument for background checks generally goes something like, background checks work, and we need to expand background checks in order to prevent guns from winding up in the wrong hands. Reasonable people can agree that this kind of common sense measure is necessary.
And the pro-gun response to this is usually something along the lines of, background checks are completely worthless. Criminals don't follow the law and will obtain guns through other means, while gun owners submit to greater and greater regulatory burdens and increased exposure to injustice.
It might seem totally obvious that if any background check has ever stopped the wrong person from getting a gun, then more background checks must be more better. And because we can all agree that people with malicious intent, be it the result of a sane or ill mind, should not have access to weapons, then screening people at the point of purchase is a reasonable thing to do.
Assuming this does anything to address or interdict the method by which most criminals obtain their guns. And it doesn't. Most guns used in crime are from underground sales, sales that are already illegal, or transfers that would not be subject to a background check anyway, like transfers between relatives. The number of sales to criminals that are currently legal that would become illegal with the new law is small.
Putting aside entirely issues of constitutionality or practical implementation, Expanding background checks has a serious math problem which will prevent them from ever being effective. Stick with me, because this is going to involve some counterintuitive freakonomics. I was personally never good at math, so I have to have this explained to me in crayon to really grasp it, but once you get it, not only will you feel smarter for knowing it, but you'll also see it everywhere. So strap on your thinking cap and follow along with me. I have here the data for 2017. In that year, there were over 25 million NICS background checks. That's 25 million people walking into a gun store, filling out their paperwork, and legally buying a gun. 180,000 of those background checks were denied. That's less than 1%. Of those 180,000 denials, a mere 12,000 were investigated by the ATF. Of those 12,000 investigations, there were 12 federal prosecutions. That's about one federal prosecution per 2 million background checks.
Wow.
Now, this is just federal data. Some states are investigating and prosecuting some of these denials through their own systems, but a lot of them just don't or can't follow up with all of them.
Okay, so there's a lot of denials that don't get followed up on, but aren't we still stopping something like 180,000 prohibited people from getting guns?
If all of those people were actually correctly prohibited from owning a gun, and if none of them went on to buy a gun on the black market, someone might be able to claim that victory. But something like 90% of these cases don't meet referral guidelines or get overturned on review. That's the long way of saying that those are all false positives. A person who has no criminal record or reason to be prohibited from buying a gun.
So something like you have the same name and birthday as a prohibited person and you get mixed up in the system?
Yeah, it's like a no-fly list.
But what's really the problem with that? Aren't we also stopping 100% of the bad guys?
Well, that depends. First of all, it's unethical to subject innocent people to this kind of injustice, forcing them into a criminal justice or bureaucratic conflict because of lazy inaccuracy. It's going to disproportionately disenfranchise those who are the least equipped to confront that kind of problem. In fact, anyone who doesn't have the time or resources to fight it will likely plead guilty in the case of criminal charges, or resign themselves to disenfranchisement if they can't get through whatever the appeals process for a denial is. There's enough of that kind of disenfranchisement going around already. Second of all, that makes some assumptions about resources, namely that addressing the false positives detracts nothing from the ability to detect or address the true positives. In the example above, 90% of the results are false. That constitutes an enormous waste of time, money, resources, and personnel, and is pretty much a guarantee that in this kind of structure, true positives don't get addressed correctly. State and federal governments already admit that they can't adequately address all of the denials. Third, that assumes that there are no false negatives, prohibited persons who erroneously pass a background check, or, where the real complexity appears, people of ill intent who do not yet have a criminal record. It also doesn't count straw purchasers, people who use their clean background to obtain guns for criminals.
Given the rate at which the millions of people who are subject to background checks actually do something dangerous or illegal, which is nearly zero, and given the rate at which failed background checks are investigated and prosecuted, also nearly zero, background checks have a higher likelihood of generating false positives than true positives.
Remember that discrepancy for later in this argument.
Okay.
This is the same problem that the TSA has. If you're screening every single passenger, each of whom has a microscopically unlikely chance of being a terrorist, the resources of the system will be consumed with identifying and investigating false positives at the expense of true positives. Which is why, despite screening every passenger with a degree of rigorousness and invasion which becomes inconvenient, the TSA fails to detect somewhere between 70 and 90% of contraband in their own internal evaluations.
Ouch. Screening a large and 99.999% harmless population is a counterproductive waste of time, which comes at the expense of effective measures. Expanding background checks are the same kind of security theater we've been trying to end for the past 20 years.
The notion that screening is effective results from a cognitive bias called the base rate fallacy, or base rate neglect. This is the good part. In our case, we're subject to a subset of that called the false positive paradox. If you want to look into this, famous psychologists like Daniel Kahneman, who wrote this great book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which I refer to all the time, people like him are really illuminating sources of information on this if you're interested in further reading. Prepare yourself for this. Given my dismal math skills, I've kind of had to simplify this for myself in order to fully understand it, but this will put a pretty strong crease in your brain once you get this. So bear with me.
Bring it on.
Here's the core of the problem. Let's say you're looking for needles in a haystack. You have a handy needle detector to make your life easier. You know for sure that one sample in every 1,000 samples is going to be a needle. You just need to find them quickly and accurately before your cows eat them by accident. The needle detector works awesome. It beeps every single time it finds a needle. Guaranteed.
Every time?
Every time. But since nothing is perfect, 5% of the time it beeps, that's because it thinks some hay is a needle. So if the machine beeps, what are your chances that you've detected a needle?
Well, if it's wrong 5% of the time, then there's a 95% chance it's correct, right?
You'd think that, but it's actually way lower. And here comes the math part. If 1 in every 1,000 samples is in fact a needle, and 5% are false positives, that means that 50 samples in every 1,000 are false positive. That means that a beep indicates a 1 in 50 chance that the machine is correct. The probability that you've detected a needle when that machine beeps is 2%.
So you're shoveling hay into your needle detector and it's beeping away, separating needles from the hay. And this whole time it's just making another haystack?
Expanding background checks is like thinking you're going to find more needles by starting with a bigger haystack. If anything, we should be starting with a smaller haystack.
Well, hell, forget the haystack. We need to go to the needle factory and turn off the needle machine.
Using data-driven, evidence-based policing, combined with programs to improve social, economic, and environmental conditions in high-crime neighborhoods, we should be making positive interventions into the lives of those most negatively affected by violence, instead of wasting resources on impersonal and ineffective population-level solutions. Whether or not someone is going to do violence is highly correlated with whether or not they've been exposed to violence as a victim or an observer. Intervening at that level gives us, by far, more bang for our buck.
So what actually works? Targeted intelligence. Identifying the constellation of environmental, social, and psychological factors that contribute to suicide, violence, and crime. Making compassionate interventions into communities in which those problems are the most severe. Real intelligence and real data will generate actual results, as opposed to broad brush, crude, and coarse population-level strategies.
This is why intelligence agencies catch more terrorists than the TSA does. We should be addressing this at the needle level, not the haystack level, and taking cues from programs like Operation Ceasefire. Now, the flip side of this is that background checks do occasionally sort of work. There are some number of people who don't realize that they're prohibited from purchasing a gun for any number of reasons. Restraining orders, active warrants, felony records, parole, probation, etc. I've sat in the waiting room of the Philadelphia gun permit office and overheard conversations between applicants and the clerks wherein people discover that, yes, a felony conviction does indeed prohibit you from buying and carrying a gun, even if that conviction was 20 years ago. The background check failure is their first inkling that they can't legally buy a gun, and their failing that background check does indeed prevent them from purchasing a gun in that instant. Background checks do stop prohibited persons from making gun purchases from licensed dealers, assuming the licensed dealer is obeying the law and assuming that the background check doesn't return a false negative.
However, there's nothing stopping them from obtaining a gun through other means. There's nothing interdicting that process. Background checks do stop prohibited persons from buying guns from licensed dealers. Background checks don't stop prohibited persons from buying guns overall. Nobody who knows they're prohibited from buying a gun is going to go try to make a purchase from a licensed dealer.
And for the vast majority of us, dealing with the background check when buying a gun is like taking off your shoes and belt when you go through airport security. It's a brief inconvenience which has been normalized through frequent and routine exposure, but you can't help feeling that it's a degrading insult to everyone's intelligence who's participating in it.
Yeah, there's a psychological cost and a grind on your dignity to suffer through something that everybody knows is just a pointless waste of time. And that cost goes up if you have the wrong name or the wrong skin color.
Next episode is episode 2.5, a bonus episode about our background stories, how we got here, and how our liberal beliefs led us to gun ownership.
yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about how our values influenced our journey.
Yeah, me too. Coming to you live from the basement. It's Guns Guide to Liberals.
It's not a basement, it's a command center.
From our underground command center in the frozen north, it's Guns Guide to Liberals.
That's way too amazing. Oh, God. Okay. Oh, God damn. Okay.